Years were expended on all this, but there's a lot of satisfaction in developing ideas into realities which become a part of Disneyland. We're not out to make a fast dollar with gimmicks. We're interested in doing things that are fun, in bringing pleasure and especially laughter to people. And probably most important of all, when we consider a new project, we really study it. Not just the surface idea, but everything about it. And when we go into that new project, we believe in it all the way. We have confidence in our ability to do it right, and we work hard to do the best possible job. My role, well, you know, I was stumped one day when a little boy asked, "Do you draw Mickey Mouse?" And I had to admit I do not draw anymore. Well, then you think up all the jokes and ideas. No, I said, I don't do that. Finally, he looked at me and said, "Mr. Disney, just what do you do?" Well, I said, sometimes I think of myself as a little bee. I go from one area of the studio to another and gather pollen and sort of stimulate everybody. I guess that's the job I do.
In fact, architectural critic Jane Jacobs, who kind of saved the lower portion of New York, claimed that most communities have a role. They have a person called a bumblebee who goes from place to place and people to people and tends to bring people together. As an urban planner, it's one of the things I seek out. I seek out the community's bumblebees as a way of trying to bring those kind of communities together. But what an amazing organization. I will disagree with Walt. I think that was Santa's workshop. Don't you? It was like walking through there. And Walt loved going to WED. This was his sandbox. He loved playing with models, so he'd go in what was called the boxcar, which was the model shop at WED. And it was in Burbank for a little while until they moved it to Glendale. An uncomfortable facility, but he would go in there and he'd play with the models with Harriet Burns and Fred Yoger and a few of the other guys. And they'd just play with this stuff. It was great. Now Disneyland opens. And I'm going to show you a very special film. Hopefully this will pop up. Should be not that. Oops, gotta go back one slide. As I said, I modified this one just for you guys. I have some footage that Jeff Curdy, an incredibly great human being, got me. This is Walt Disney, the executives from Santa Fe Railroad, the day before Disneyland's opening, on a fire-up party of the E.P. Ripley. Wow. Yes, OSHA was not around those days. Now, some things to note about this, I got to talk a little bit about, because I've had the good fortune and like Jim, talking to a lot of the people who were the people with Walt, and Walt was the kind of guy that he knew he could be very intimidating, that people sort of thought of him as mythology, and they would sort of not be themselves around him. So Walt did a lot of kind of really screwy things to humanize himself. For example, when he would go to a major executive, he would take his tie and he would screw his tie up, and he'd get his collar all wrong, and they'd look at him and going, "Is this Walt Disney or is this some doofus that just come walking into the door?" Bob Gurr's favorite one was his pork pie hat. He had this weird little hat that he'd constantly keep pulling out of his pocket. He'd stick it on top of his head, and he didn't position it correctly. It just, wherever it landed, and he would leave it like that the entire time. But you know, this is a boy playing with his favorite toy. He graduated from a 1/8 scale train. They took the same drawings. Roger Broggie and the crew in the machine shop took the same drawings that Walt had for the 1/8 scale train and blew it up to 5/8 scale. If you're ever at Disneyland and either the CK Holiday or the E.P. Ripley are running, you do know that you could ride on the tender car and go around the park, and you're basically inside of the cab watching the engineer and the fireman go ahead and run the train. It's one of my all-time favorite things to do. They're there, I'm putting it back in the barn. Walt seemed to prefer the E.P. Ripley. The E.P. Ripley was kind of considered the Cadillac of the two trains. If you ask most of the engineers, they say it's really the smoothest of the trains to operate. It's a lot of fun. They say the CK Holiday can be a little testy at times. And then the other three trains at Disneyland are full-fledged Baldwin locomotives pulling bananas, and they just feel a lot different. I'd also learned by talking to Ron and Diane that Walt was a very touchy guy. He would constantly be touching you, hugging you, grabbing you, pushing you. What you didn't want the touch was called the chest thump. If he was really, really mad at you, he'd start tapping you on your chest in such a way. I asked Bob Gurr about it. Bob said it was like putting his hand in your heart, pulling it out and showing it to you. And they tended to avoid getting on Walt's bad side to get that. They didn't mind the eyebrow quite as much. You just didn't want to get the chest up. Beautiful train. It was really one of the few that was ever kind of created. Yeah, Wosha. Yeah, just down in the back there, dude.
Boy, no seat belts at all, huh?
No, not at all.
Gee.
Thank you, Jeff Curdy, for providing this one for me.
Yeah, that's cool.
Fun stuff. What I'm going to talk about next is really some of the building blocks of Disney design. These are the things that Walt and the Imagineers had developed over the many, many years that have been applied to virtually all of the parks. When the parks tend to follow what I'm about to show you, the parks succeed. When the parks tend not to show you, you get the studios at Disneyland Paris and you get California Adventure before they just spent $1.2 billion to fix it. And Walt did this through empirical data. And I'll get at the very end of this in just a slight little weird technical way about a guy named Christopher Alexander. When I'm doing my Imagineering talk, that's actually a bulk of what the talk is going to be. But these are guys who study the built environment the way you should. And I asked Diane, what was it like traveling with your dad? And she says, this happened a lot. And I asked, what was that? She says, he was counting steps. When he would go to a space that he really, really, really liked, he would count the steps and he would measure how wide the streets were. He would make little notes of things. What he did is in this memory, he would start to collect all of the bits and pieces of the world that he traveled, the parts that he liked the best, and he thought, I'll combine that. So let's go through quickly what some of these things are. And a lot of these you might know, some of these you might be surprised about. The berm. Of course, Walt Disney had the berm at Carrollwood, his home in Holmby Hills. Bill Evans put it in there. The idea was that Walt didn't want to bother the neighbors. Quite honestly, I think Walt didn't want the neighbors looking down on his train. That's why he did it, and it allowed him to both get rid of noise and also was able to hide it. When he designed Disneyland, there's a 12 to 14 foot berm of dirt that goes all the way around it that deadens the sound of all the surrounding community, and it defines the outside edge. And it defines the place that you are in. It's what it is that hides the outside world. At Walt Disney World, he had even a grander berm. It was these giant swamps that surrounded everything. So the berm was essential. The berm today in the new Disney nomenclature is the point when you cross the threshold and you enter into the store, for instance, or onto the cruise ship. That is now the new berm. So the berm is a definite Disney idea. The next thing was the single entrance. All World's fairs and all amusement parks up until Disneyland had multiple entrances. They usually had it close to either public transportation or parking. Disneyland was the first one to ever have a single entrance because Walt wanted to do a couple things. He wanted, first of all, to know how many people were inside and outside of his park. But he also wanted to have sort of a mind changer. He wanted you to have the entire family come together and to experience the same thing before they go off on their adventures. And it's exactly like the television shows. When you think about it, Walt would be in his office, right? He'd grab a book off the shelf, he'd open the book, he'd start showing you what he was talking about. He wanted to make sure that everybody was on the same page. That was the benefit of the single entrance. Now, if anybody's going to say you can get on the monorail and go into the second entrance, I agree, but that's different. The next one, and this one's very, very important. This is from John Hench, and it's the idea of no visual contradictions. You see, there's a bit of a difference between cities and designing a city and designing a theme park. In a city, Robert Venturi and Jane Jacobs claim that there's a certain messy vitality that's necessary. That when you're entering a new space, you kind of need to be just a little on edge, a little awake so that you're alive and you're engaged and you're constantly kind of checking things out. Now, if you have too much messy vitality, it becomes very threatening and uncomfortable. In a theme park, John Hench claims that you need to get rid of all of the visual contradictions, that nothing doesn't support the story. The buildings, the architecture, the materials, where you place doorknobs, everything supports the either explicit or implied story. What that does is it gives you a sense of reassurance, which I'll get into much more detail because that is the critical factor. The hub and spoke, of course. You come in through the single entrance, you walk down Main Street. John Hench suggested that you needed to have a lot of room, because families are big, and you need to give them a lot of room so they can sort of stop, decompress, figure out where they're at, figure out where they want to go, and have some of that space without feeling like you're constantly getting bashed by other people. So that's why you have the hub. And the hub also gave you the opportunity to look and to get a preview, like all movie guys, giving you a preview of the different lands and see where you wanted to go. And what was it that was going to attract you into the land? The weenie, which would be like the castle, or I'll have to talk on Disneyland. In this case, there are the weenie would be the main weenie, of course, is the castle, and weenies always have movement. So you look through the castle and you can see the carousel going. So you look that way. If you go and you're looking this way, you're seeing Tomorrowland. That's when you had the Astro Orbiter, just like you have it here high on the tower where it belongs, instead of in the ditch in the front where they have it now. I'm sorry, occasionally my personal opinion is going to come out, all right? When you looked at Frontierland, you had the stockade gates and you had the Mark Twain whistling and pulling you forward. The weenie worked like a beckoning hand. Now, who can tell me what the weenie is for Adventureland? No, Jim, you can't tell me the answer. Who can tell me what the weenie is for Adventureland in Disneyland? Anybody? Anybody?
Oh, the Tiki Room.
There is no weenie in Adventureland, because if Adventureland had a weenie, you would know what's there and it wouldn't be an adventure now. Actually, the weenie, the visual thing that you actually see is the men's restroom. That's the weenie. And the term weenie came from the silent film era, where when you wanted to get the dog to jump, you had a hot dog and you did this. And Walt had a real passion for hot dogs as well, too, apparently, I understand. So that's the weenie. Another Disney hallmark, of course, is spatial manipulation. These were all movie guys. In fact, most of the original Imagineers were all guys who kind of, in a sense, got laid off or escaped from 20th Century Fox. And there's a really good reason for that. Because 20th Century Fox had a movie backlot that was 4 times the size of Disneyland. And it had a river and a river town and a country town. It had a paddle wheel ship. You could, if you put a turnstile on the front of it, it could have been a theme park. So these guys understood, and in forced perspective, which is something you've heard a lot about, in the movies it adds depth to the 2-dimensional film. In 3-dimensional design, it tends to add height, but it does it in such a way where it feels comfortable and it feels safe and you feel in control and command. With the spatial manipulation. There's also shrink and edit, taking historic things, shrinking them, editing them so that you can create a new building that supports the story that you're trying to deal with. I think for a lot of us, and I think one of the other big motivations for Disneyland was clean. Because Walt loved going to amusement parks. He loved taking the kids to like Beverly Center and all those kind of parks like that. But Lillian didn't like it because she thought they were very dirty and they were very unsafe. And you know, she was right. They were very dirty and they were unsafe. Walt said, I'm not going to build that. That's why I'm building Disneyland. I wanted something that was hyper clean. Every central business district that you go into America now has a special district that has funding to keep it super clean, all because of Disneyland. Finally, and I think this is, in my head, the most important thing to understand about Disney design, and John Hench termed it as the architecture of reassurance. Some people say I go there for the fantasy, but to the Disney folks, it's the reassurance. When you walk into the Disney theme park, and this is the explanation that you can give to people when you say, I'm going to Walt Disney World again, I'm going to Disneyland, and your friends and neighbors go, weren't you just there like a few weeks ago or a couple of months ago, and aren't you kind of crazy? Tell them about the architecture of reassurance, because when you enter the berm and you go into the train station, what you have is not a fantasy. What you have is a world that reassures you that everything could function correctly, that people can be friendly, that the world can be clean. John Hench once said that you have the permission to talk to strangers. It's this concept of reassurance, I believe, is the emotional attachment that drives us again and again to the park. Because we can go back and we can fill up that tank again and say, you know what, as screwy as the world is, I feel safe here. And I'll give you a really good illustration about what I mean. 2 gentlemen were walking through Disneyland. Almost sounds like a joke, doesn't it? Walt Disney, and he was escorting the Reverend Billy Graham. And the Reverend Billy Graham turned to Walt one day, he's doing this trip, and he says, hey, Walt, you know what? You got a nice fantasy here. Now, you would think that Walt Disney would be polite and go, well, thank you, Reverend Graham. I appreciate that. Apparently, that wasn't the case. Apparently, Walt got kind of mad at him. Got the eyebrow. You all know about the eyebrow, right? When the eyebrow comes up, you know. Didn't quite get the chestnut, but I got the eyebrow. So he turned to him, and this is, I got to quote this because this is so important. So Walt turns to Billy Graham and he says, you know, the fantasy isn't here. This is very real. The park is reality. The people are natural here. They're having a good time. They're communicating. This is what people really are. The fantasy is out there, outside the gates of Disneyland, where people have hatreds and people have prejudices. It's not really real. I think that sums up the architecture of reassurance better than anybody could possibly state it. And you can use that line when you're asked, when people look at you kind of cockeyed and go, why are you going back again? You tell them because that's where reality is. That the hatred's out here. So when you have all of this and it all comes together like this, why would you not want to change the world? So now, for the rest of this talk, I'm going to focus on the 3 big projects that Walt was working on prior to his death. And this is really important because by the time he's working on these 3 projects, he wasn't really doing much with the studio, and he wasn't, quite frankly, doing much with Disneyland either, because he was really quite obsessive doing these 3 things. I think he kind of knew that he had to provide a legacy. So the first one was the Mineral King Ski Resort, which was going to be in the Sierra Nevadas. Lillian loved the mountains. They loved skiing. Walt loved skiing. He was pretty doofus about it. Lillian was really quite a good skier, as I understand it. And the family really, really loved winter sports. And so they didn't really like the ski resorts that are around the United States. And so if Walt didn't like something, he just would build one for himself. So he decided he wanted to build a ski resort. So he was really encouraged by this guy here, Hannes Schroll. Hannes Schroll was an Australian ski champion who Walt met at Badger Pass here in Yosemite. He taught Walt how to ski. By the way, this is Diane. Diane did not know how to ski. That's why she's looking down. This was the first time she was ever on skis. She told me that her dad wouldn't let her ski and that she had to teach herself when she was 16 years old because he didn't want her to get hurt. So Hannes Schroll was this great guy, and he worked with Walt and he talked to Walt. Oh, you know what? You all know who Hannes Schroll is. Let me show you.
There you go.
You all know this guy.
Yeah.
That's Hannes Schroll. Apparently what this guy would do is he would go skiing down the slopes at like 75 miles per hour, yodeling, so much so that they brought him to the studio and recorded all of his yodeling. And what he did is he convinced Walt to be the first investor in a ski resort near Truckee called Sugar Bowl, which still exists today. And as part of the deal, they took one of the mountains, which was called Hemlock Mountain, and they renamed it Mount Disney. Yes, there is a Mount Disney in California that you can ski on today. Now, Walt loved this so much, and you know, if he liked something, he would use it again and again. Jim, what film is this?
No, that's the goofy...
The Art of Skiing.
Right.
And what he did is he took the Sugar Bowl Lodge, and he ended up recreating it, and that was where it was an advertisement for the thing that he had just invested in a couple of years before. All of this reignited his interest in winter sports, and another thing that was really quite important was this. This is Walt and Lillian in Zermatt, Switzerland in about July 1958. They were there to watch the filming of what is probably, I think, one of the best Disney live-action films that nobody has ever seen, Third Man and the Mountain. If you can find a copy of it, you will be awestruck. I mean, it is even today, it is an amazingly cool film. And so he was there, and the director, Anakin, said that when Walt was there, he kept staring at the Matterhorn. He just loved staring at the Matterhorn. He would sit there for hours staring at the Matterhorn. All this excitement about Zermatt and all this sort of stuff got him so excited that he decided to volunteer and go ahead and do the Winter Olympics opening and closing ceremonies. Here's a nice shot of it. By the way, this is the opening ceremony. If we saw this picture about 40 minutes before, you wouldn't see anything because a blizzard had just hit. Apparently, God was kind of nice to Walt because about a half an hour before the television broadcast started, the clouds departed, the skies became perfectly blue. In Pasadena, where I'm at, we would do that with the Rose Parade as well. We always do. But you know what? He loved the Matterhorn so much, he decided to bring a souvenir home. He brought the Matterhorn home with him. And he wrote a postcard to Harriet Burns, and on the back of the postcard, he sent 2 postcards. He wrote, "Build this." and Harriet Burns and the other people in the model shop ended up using the 2 postcards to design the Matterhorn. Now, I got to use this as, here's another little urban planning thing, because you learn about a lot of that in the book. There's this idea called form follows function. And Walt didn't just build things just to build things. There usually was a real purpose. And this is a good example of it. When they ended up building Sleeping Beauty Castle, and they dug the moat in front, they took all the dirt and they piled it up on the side, and it became known as things as Holiday Hill, Snow Mountain. There's all sorts of different names for it. It wasn't accessible to the public. I know that Bobby told me this is where the Mouseketeers used to go hang out, because it was the Mouseketeer Circus was just beyond it. So this is where they hung out. One time they found marijuana plants on the back. They quickly ripped those up. But Walt wanted to put it to some good use, and he brought home, of course, the first Skyway system in the United States that came to Disneyland. And the main support was on top of Holiday Hill. And he looked at it and he's like, this is just ugly. I just don't like the aesthetics of it. So that was primarily one of the main reasons why he decided to build the Matterhorn, because he built the tower inside of it. So it was a way of hiding something that was an aesthetic eyesore by creating something that was just substantially more that was there. So let me give you a little tour. Now, let's first to understand Zermatt. Zermatt is a little town in Switzerland, and I got two very special things that came from the archives that was part of my talk in January. Here's a real short little film.
Since I was anxious to begin my new assignment, I could have wished for a faster train. But this unique Cog Railroad is the only way to Zermatt.
You see, Zermatt was a little village, but it was only accessible by train. You couldn't drive there. So that once you got to the town, it was a pedestrian-friendly town. Walt really liked this, because why not? It's a train, right?
World-renowned tourist town at the base of the Matterhorn. From the moment you first arrive, you know Zermatt is a village dedicated to mountain climbing.
So Walt decided to take it home with him to California because he wanted his wife to have a nice ski resort that matched what he wanted to have in a ski resort. So he came up with the idea, he bid, the National Park Service put a bid out to a number of investors to go ahead and build a ski resort in Mineral King. The Sierra Club in 1949 had identified Mineral King as one of the most ideal locations for a ski resort. Willie Scheffler, who was important because he was the guy who laid out the ski resort or the ski slopes for the 1960 Winter Olympics, said that it was the finest alpine atmosphere anywhere in the United States and was even better than most of the places in Europe, and was very big about it. The deal was that Mineral King was completely surrounded by the world's greatest berm, the Sequoia National Park. The reason it wasn't included in the national park was it was a mining town back in the 1870s, and it was too disturbed and it didn't meet the needs. It did come under the National Park Service, were the people who were going to manage it. And there was a number of investors. Walt wasn't even the highest bid, but he had the best bid. He was competing against a whole bunch of people, including the people who did Squaw Valley. Also, Walt, many of you may not know, almost bought Mammoth Mountain. He had a deal that was so done. They had the contracts done. The McCoy family were at the studio, and they were about to sign the papers, and at the very last minute, they went to the office, and the children said that, you know what, we don't want to sell our dad's resort. We're going to take it over. And Walt said, you know what, if the kids are going to step up, this is a good thing. Go ahead. I'm not going to buy it. Just pushed the papers away and said, I'm glad that you guys are going to take care of your dad's investment. And so that's why he didn't buy Mammoth Mountain. So it got him really excited about going ahead and doing Mineral King. And I got to point this out because this is going to be really important here. See this little stretch of road right here through the national park? Keep that in mind because that comes an important player later on in our story here. The idea was, and hold your book up. The idea was, Arlen brought me something that I had been told about, but this doesn't actually even exist in the Disney archives because we couldn't get it out of the archives for the presentation when I was doing the research for the presentation. This is the plan for Mineral King.
Don't put that down in your bag. I ain't going home with you.
But the idea was is that you park in a parking lot that was in Silver City, which is right about here. Walt owned all of Silver City. He bought the whole area. He bought the whole town. And he was going to put a parking garage for 3,600 cars, and you would park your car in the parking garage, and then you would get on this Cog Railroad. The Cog Railroad would take you the 8 or so miles through the National Forest and deposit you in this wonderful little village. He was so excited about this, and he had such support from the state of California that Governor Brown came out and they did this wonderful little press conference. He was pretty ill. He didn't look very good in these pictures, and it's kind of in a sense sort of tragic when you see the film of the press conference, because you know that Walt's not feeling really good, but like the true champion he is, he rose to the occasion and he was having fun with the governor. And this was to promote it. The state of California was going to invest $30 million to turn that little thing into a highway so that people could go ahead and access where the train was going to start. There was support. This is Willie Scheffler right there. It was a big deal in California, and it was the perfect location because it was 270 miles or so from San Francisco, about 230 miles from Los Angeles. It was right in the middle of the state. It was a really big deal, and this is what Mineral King looked like when they originally were going to do it, and this is the vision of what Walt wanted. He wanted to take that little village of Zermatt and he wanted to go ahead and place it on the valley floor. And he wanted to retain the things that really made Zermatt magical, which was looking up at the vistas of all the mountains. Now, it's kind of a conflict when it comes to a ski resort because you have to have ski lifts, right? Not here. What he was going to do is camouflage all the ski lifts. There was going to be 14 ski lifts in the project. And they were going to hide them all. And they even came up with a super high capacity ski lift that got patented, and they tried to